Good evening, Council. Thanks for bringing us in. I just want to give an update. On the agenda is the borrowing for the tax-exempt borrowing for the $4 million. Tonight we brought in Scott Shearer from PFM and Brian Koscelansky, who's the city's bond counsel. They're here to address any questions, really give an explanation. Scott has a presentation that he handed out to you to give you more background. We've been working with both Brian and Scott and Melissa from PFM really since July on this borrowing. So we're going to bring you up to date on where we've been through and the background of the borrowing here, and Scott, and we'll take some questions on that you may have.
Mr. Dodd, is this borrowing? Is this the borrowing that came before us back in June 20th?
This is part of it. That was a notice that put on, lets the city extend for this capital borrowing to go back 90 days.
Yeah, that was the reimbursement resolution, and that was really just a tax code provision that allows, once you adopt that resolution, any money that you've spent on capital projects going back 60 days before that passage, you can reimburse those expenses when you do the borrowing. So it just gives that time frame. To the extent you had to spend some money, it allowed us to recapture more capital projects that you were spending out of your general fund. But it's all tied together. That was just the first step in this process.
So you're here tonight to speak about that process?
Yes. And the ordinance that you have on first reading, last meeting, second tonight, and then hopefully third next week, that is the actual full borrowing resolution that's required by the Local Government and Debt Act to complete that process. But I'll let Scott go through the numbers.
Before we get started with what's on the agenda for tonight, back on the 20th of June, I asked some questions about this, and this is great that you're here in front of us for those questions. Can you just walk us through the process that occurred in June?
Oh, sure.
So we know where we're at for tonight.
When we first started looking at the best way to finance this on the cheapest basis for the city, and what we looked at was the tax code requires us, or only allows us to finance certain things on a tax-exempt basis. Otherwise, you have to do it taxable, which increases your rates and your borrowing costs during the term of the loan. So one of the things we typically look at is the city or any municipality, when you're looking at borrowing for what would otherwise be a taxable project, are there things we could finance tax-exempt and really just replace those dollars? We looked at with the city that the city was spending and has spent on capital items out of your general fund, during the course of this year, going into next year, monies from the general fund for those capital items. Those capital items we can finance on a tax-exempt basis at a cheaper cost. So really all we were doing was replacing those general fund dollars with the borrowing dollars so that then you can use those general fund monies to do other projects that we couldn't otherwise finance, including the repayment of court awards, other items of that nature. So it was really just a matter of finding the best way of getting that amount of money into the city at the cheapest cost. And that, I'm sorry, go ahead. And that reimbursement resolution really just kind of set that stage for, if you don't have a reimbursement resolution in place, when you do your tax-exempt borrowing, you cannot go back and reimburse yourself for capital costs that you may have spent. That reimbursement resolution allows us to set that time frame, and it goes back 60 days before that date. So when we look at all the money you spend on capital, we can go back to that date, count everything till we can get to closing, which on our current schedule is mid-November, or early to mid-November, recapture all of those dollars. Those go back to the city the day of closing. The balance of the funds gets spent on capital projects as you're doing those projects. So that was really just the first step to get as much time frame into that process as we could to recapture those costs.
Now, this $4 million and some change, is it specifically capital?
It has to be
projects?
Capital items, yes.
Because I heard you say court awards. Is any of this money going to court awards?
No,
it
it's really, once again, we're just kind of substituting dollars that the city is expending for things that we could finance on a tax-exempt basis. So none of these dollars from a tax standpoint and from a documentation standpoint are being spent on anything other than documented capital projects.
So the city will be using the money to settle those, to pay those settlements from the actual, or from our budget.
General fund.
General fund.
Yes, like the previous payment that was made, right. And
Let me ask you this. If we weren't doing this $4 million borrowing, we wouldn't have the $4 million in the capital fund to be able to pay those, correct? Is that fair?
I mean, be sure you got the question right. If we weren't doing the borrowing, we'd be able to pay the court awards
Right,
from the general fund.
correct.
That's what we're doing. And the reason why we're going this route is because when you pull down from the general fund for these types of court awards, it's a hit to the fund balance. And the city just got their credit rating increased this past year. And one of the things they look at is the fund balance. And a large drawn down like that is a negative. So what we're doing with the capital, the way we're reimbursing the general fund is taking this money and it'll go into the general fund, but it'll be in a restricted account in the general fund, and it will leave pressure on the budgets next year. I've also worked with our auditor, Dan Seifert, who was here, so we can account for this next year. So next year, we're looking at probably putting into the budget a line item that would transfer money into the budget for a revenue that would be used for identified below capital projects. So it will come out of a special account so we can track it that way, so this money is only being expended on capital projects. So really what we're doing is this money will go into the general fund, but it'll be separated accounts. So that way when the rating agencies and the creditors look at it, they say, you dropped it down, but you did put money in there.
So the money we're borrowing can only be utilized for capital projects.
Correct.
Any other funds that are left over in the capital budget or within our existing budget can be utilized to pay off those settlement agreements.
The general fund balance.
Correct. General fund, right.
Yep. Right.
Excuse me, yeah.
We're not going to start drawing down on this account until we start doing some of these capital projects next year.
Well, what we can do as we get to move forward towards closing is one of the things we should do is identify capital items within that time frame of 60 days before the June date when we pass the reimbursement resolution, and reimburse the city for those costs that they spent with their general fund monies. It's easier from a tax standpoint because if it's all reimbursement, on the day that we close, that comes back to the city free and clear of any of the restrictions on capital borrowings going forward because you've spent those for capital items within that reimbursement period. So, and that may be, 500,000, it may be $1 million, it may be 200,000, but whatever that number is, it just makes sense to do that. At closing, the balance of the funds will go in that separate account to be drawn down as you pay for capital projects going forward. Things that you are going to pay out of your general fund anyway.
I have a quick question.
What's the
Matt.
date of closing?
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the date of closing?
November 8th.
November 8th.
So, does the city have insurance for any litigation settlements or awards?
Does the city have insurance?
Insurance, yeah.
I have to ask the legal office if we have insurance that covers these, but I don't think we do. That's why we're doing the borrowing. That would have to be something that I think I can ask Jessica, the solicitor.
Oh, would you get that answer from me, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So if you're okay, I will just kind of briefly go through this handout just to kind of let you know a little bit of the process that we went through. But I think between Matt and Brian, they summarized it real well. As we've been working on this for kind of many months, kind of looking at the interest rate market itself, kind of analyzing whether to use cash, whether to borrow, what kind of implications that may have on the credit rating. I think Matt made a very good point that with the increase in the city's credit rating back a couple months ago, that was kind of big news, getting us back into investment grade rating. We've been working with the city for quite a long time, and obviously that was great news. And the one thing that the credit rating agency kept pointing to was the liquidity, the available liquidity of the city, meaning the general fund balance. So something kind of newer that's been unfolding here over the past couple of years, and that was really the main catalyst for looking and ultimately moving towards the upgrade from the rating agency. And as Brian mentioned, I think was a great point, the goal here was to do a financing. So the interest rate market itself led our analysis to it's better to borrow. Right, so then we said, okay, we're going to borrow. Let's move forward with an RFP process with all the local banks to go for that. Then in discussions with Brian, it was how do we borrow the most efficient way? There's kind of different ways to do this kind of financing. And the way we have it here, the structure to pay for these capital projects, it allowed us to do this all on a tax exempt basis, which obviously is what we want to do to get you the lowest overall interest rate over the life of the loan, as well as the lowest overall upfront cost. So we were kind of connecting all the dots here and doing the best overall financing that the city can do, and also protecting the credit rating as well, and what's kind of best overall for the city's budget. So the handout that we went through, we do this kind of for all of our different transactions. We have it dated for October 3rd on the front cover. That would just coincide with the third and final reading if you continue to move forward of the ordinance. But on page 2, just real briefly, we always show a couple different interest rate charts. But if you go to the middle page, or I'm sorry, the middle section on page 2, this is a tax-exempt index that we track closely for all of our financings, and it goes back to the early 90s. And basically the point of this, and there's all sorts of different facts and figures in that middle chart, but it's showing right now that we're still a little better than historical averages when we look at the borrowing costs. So that helped us in our analyses that the borrowing cost, which is what we care about here, is better, lower than historical averages, and the investment rate that we can get, whether it's on the city's general fund or whether it's on these borrowed proceeds, is higher than average. So that's good. So all the stars kind of connected and aligned that way. So from an interest rate perspective and overall market, things look real good. Then on page 3, so as I mentioned, we put out an RFP, a request for proposal, to a whole host of different local and regional banks. And on page 3 shows a quick summary of the responses that we received through that RFP process. So we got 7 different financial institutions that responded, varying interest rates. Some were fixed rates, some were variable rates, some had higher fees, some kind of all different. But at the end of the day, the row highlighted in yellow, row number 5, the proposal from M&T Bank, overall was the best financing. It was the cleanest financing. It had the best interest rate, lowest cost, and it kind of checked all the boxes, and that's ultimately what we decided to move forward with in the ordinance. Now, the proposal came through at a 4.75%, and that changes based on kind of daily market movements. And so in talking to the bank, they were then able to lock that rate in shortly thereafter at a 4.85, so it wasn't the 4.75. The market actually had increased quite a bit more than that. The market increased probably closer to, I'd say, a 5% over the past week or so, but again, we were able to lock in, so it's set in stone to 4.85%. But again, overall, different responses from FNC, Fidelity, JP Morgan, M&T, Peoples, and PNC, and then we had a few others look at it and just decided to pass on it. But the M&T proposal was the cleanest. And then on the next page just shows a summary of
So
how...
Can I ask why was it the cleanest? I noticed that it is the only one that is callable at any time. Was that a differentiator?
That's a big, well, number one, the interest rate was the lowest, so it's a fixed interest rate for the full term, and it was also the lowest. And it's also, again, prepayable at any time with no penalty. And we feel that's very important for your debt, that if, whether it's a year from now, 5 years from now, whatever the case may be, that if you have excess cash and your liquidity position looks good, you can take this debt off the books.
Or any portion of it as well, you could pay.
Or portion, yeah. So that's a very important piece, because over the years, we have been able to pay down some of the city's debt through other means, and we always want to do it with the most efficient financings out there, meaning the ones that are callable at any time or past their call date. And so again, the M&T proposal from an interest rate, from a callability.
Can you tell us why the 4.27 by JP Morgan Chase doesn't beat the 4.7?
The 4.27 was non-callable, which means you can never pay it off. You can never refinance it.
Okay.
Yep, so that's kind of, again, that's sort of a big deal. Something that's very frowned upon in our industry, to have non-callable debt, because again, we want to make sure, and it gives you the ability to call it. It puts kind of all the leverage in your hands, not the bank's hands.
So that should interest rates drop,
you're able to refinance it.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Or if you need to restructure for some reason, you have that flexibility.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks. I just wanted, because if somebody's looking at this, they're
Yeah, no,
thinking,
great question.
You're just looking at interest rates, and there's lower ones on there, but there's reasons why they're lower.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, great question.
And I think one other item on the JP Morgan piece, if you look all the way over on the right-hand side, they were indicative rates, so they weren't locked in, and they probably have moved up over the
Quite a
last
bit.
couple of weeks as well. So this was at the time that they received the bids a couple of weeks ago, or the quotes at that time.
Thanks, Brian.
But yeah, that fixed rate is 4.85.
4.85,
It's changed
correct.
since the 4.75, but
That's right.
it's locked in from here till closing.
Locked in, yep, exactly. So then page 4 just illustrates how this debt fits in with your existing debt. So up top, kind of first in box number 1, The net proceeds basically going to be $4 million after you net out fees, and we'll get to that shortly. The term, it's basically a 9-year transaction. Settlement, November 8th. The structure is what we call a wrap structure, where we sort of wrap around the new principal around your existing debt. And the assumed tax status, again, tax exempt is what we really care about. So in column 4 is the annual debt service related to this loan. So that's the principal and interest in column 4, about $194,000 to $197,000 per year out through 2029. And then you see those bigger payments in 2030 and 2031. Well, then you got to look at to the left in column 3. Column 3 is all your existing debt right now that you're currently paying. And you see that substantial drop-off in your existing debt in 2030 and 2031. So the two pieces kind of fit together nicely in column 5 that now shows your total debt service. So one of the things that Brian and I have to do when we're structuring these transactions is obviously, number one, making sure we're complying with federal law, and he already talked about that with the reimbursement resolution. So we need to make sure we comply with all the federal and IRS-related items. And then we also need to make sure we comply with all the state rules and regulations. So this transaction needs to be approved down in Harrisburg at the state with the Department of Community and Economic Development. And so we need to make sure that when you look at your debt in totality, so your debt service payments on an annual basis for all of your outstanding issues, bank loans, bond issues, and a new one, that it has to either be level on an annual basis or decreasing. And so again, we have to not just look kind of myopically at this transaction, but we need to look at all your existing debt and make sure everything fits together nicely, and that's what's illustrated then in column 5. So it meets kind of all the state rules and regulations as well. And then on page 5, again, this will be updated with the final rate of 4.85, but this is the actual amortization schedule that will be paid back to M&T out through 2031, showing the principal and the interest and then the annual payments as well. It's just kind of more the detail that fed back into that summary page from before. And then the next page is the sources and uses. So just to give you an idea of how things are going to be dispersed at closing. So under sources, we start with a note of $4,070,000. We have $4 million then available for projects, for capital projects only, and then fees for bond counsel, financial advisor, to the bank, and to the paying agent. And that we need to make sure the sources match the uses. And so this is a test for that. And again, showing that the closing would occur on November 8th if we keep with the schedule of second reading tonight, third and final reading next Tuesday. And then the next page is just your current, all your current bonds and bank loans, as well as then the new proposal from M&T here for the 2023 transaction in column 8. So again, just kind of shows more detail. And then the rest of this is just the actual proposal from M&T. So again, happy to answer any questions, but again, the highlight was first going down the decision path of pay cash or borrow. The financial markets dictated the analysis that more advantageous to borrow based on the environment that we're in right now. Then it's the road, how do we do it the most efficient in the borrowing, tax exempt, taxable. We talked about the structure of doing that to pay for these capital projects, and then also how this kind of fits in nicely with the narrative that the rating agency put in or put out there in their report for one of the big reasons for the credit rating upgrade. And that's extremely important to get the city back into the investment grade rating. It really does lower the cost of funds and gives the city a lot more opportunities in the future to refinance debt or secure other debt in the lowest cost possible. And with the outlook that the rating agency gave the city, you got bumped up to investment grade, BBB-, which is great, but then they also put on a positive outlook, which means that if the liquidity position of the city, meaning general fund reserves, stays strong, not necessarily excessively strong, just kind of in the same trajectory that you've been going the past couple of years, there's a chance for maybe even another upgrade, possibly next year as well. So kind of taking all that into account is how the team approached this financing and ultimately led to the ordinance before you last week, tonight, next week.
The liquidity point that Scott pointed out is why we're doing the borrowing, because we'll be drawing down the general fund balance to pay these lawsuits. But bringing in the money from the borrowing even that will decrease our liquidity, but when we bring the borrowing in, that brings us back up to a liquid point. So that is kind of offset for the S&P when they take a look at it.
And just from a quick procedural standpoint, if we go ahead with the second reading tonight, we do have to advertise before the third reading. That advertisement is over with the paper, and that's good for 30 days if there's any hiccups. Once it's finally adopted, there's a second ad that goes in the paper. We have some paperwork to sign. That goes down to the state for a 30-day review period, essentially, which gets us to that closing in the beginning of November. So that's why it takes a while. And also one of the reasons for the reimbursement resolution, recognizing that it takes several months to put all of this in place and do the bank RFPs, and you wanted to get that timeline and recapture as much as you could.
So Brian, if this passes under sixth order tonight, then it gets tabled for 30 days?
No, it doesn't get, you can do tonight's reading, next week's reading for final enactment. It's just the state has a 30-day review period, so we have to get all of that to them. We can't close within that period.
Gotcha.
So
And
you
that-
follow.
That can't happen until we pass it in seventh
Exactly.
order.
That starts the clock running.
Exactly.
Gotcha, okay.
ACD
And then
clock.
we have to put a second ad in the paper. That takes a couple days to get the proof back and things like
Okay, I
that.
was
So-
a little confused there, I thought for a
No,
second.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, you follow your normal process, but then the state has theirs, and it gets us a little bit of a delay between when you finally adopt and when we could actually close.
Okay, thank you. Do any other council members have questions?
Last question. So M&T is just taking a $5,000 fee. They get a $5,000 fee. PFM is our financial advisor on the deal, and Brian is our bond
Yes,
counsel.
I think that's for the bank's counsel.
Yeah, the M&T fee of $5,000 is for their legal counsel to review the documents. Yep.
Yeah, one way too, of looking at this too, is, this money, when we're doing the budget now, the 2024 operating budget, but some of the capital projects that are always included into the budget sucks up a lot of the revenue on our revenue side. This way here, as I mentioned before, we're working with the auditor to put a line item into next year's budget that will show this money coming in. So we have $2 million in projects for capital projects, that this money will come out of that account to borrowings. It'll be probably something like 2023 capital financing, and then capital projects like paving down below. So that'll pull some of the money away from the revenues that are coming into the budget. So this way, it'll be like a year or two where we can offset some of those costs from the borrowing, but it kind of gives us a little bit more breathing room onto the revenues coming into the city, because they won't be going for these capital projects.
We'll be able to earn some interest on that as well over that time?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
on the money, yeah.
Okay,
It'll be set up separate, similar to the debt service account.
Great.
At Fidelity, the way the debt service, and you see the debt service for next year is $194,000, and we'll include that into next year's budget as part of the total debt service. I have the rest of the debt service in the budget preparation I'm doing now, so this will just be included in there.
And hopefully with where short-term rates are and your general fund rates and returns, hopefully as that money sits there, it'll be pretty much as an offset. So
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming in this evening.
You're welcome.
I think Mr. Schuster has one more question. Oh, it sounds like we have several questions.
Borrowing like this, has ever been done in the city before? Is there any other precedents prior to this, or is this the first time
You mean tax
a
exempt
transaction is?
We've done capital borrowings and tax-exempt borrowings over the years. We've done refundings, capital borrowings. So there were a bunch of bond issues, publicly offered bond issues, also we've done bank loans for the city as well. So it is a very routine process from the actual debt side of it. It's not dissimilar from even the pension deal that you did a couple of years ago when we borrowed associated with that. Now that's all been paid off, but the process was the same.
And then I just wanted to clarify real quick. So you're saying with regards to the investment grade that this isn't going to hurt or help that grade, correct?
No, we're looking at this as the borrowing is helping.
As helping.
Kind of, like I said before, is, the drawdown for paying the court awards is kind of looked at as a negative, because you're drawing down the fund balance. And this is really, so when S&P looks at it, they'll say, well, there's this here, but the city amortized that expense over the long term with the capital borrowing, and kept their fund balance, they kept their liquidity.
And just in general, settling the litigation is a big positive as well.
Yeah.
It's now a known liability, and it's going to be off the city's books as well. So kind of twofold way to look at it.
And that's a good point, because that liability, affects the credit rating. You know, as we've been bringing down, the city's been bringing down their liability on settling lawsuits, especially the earned income tax was a big one. That was a tough nut to crack, because there was a big liability for the city if that went all the way through the process and they lost. You know, so that was, well, I think it was probably like $24 million.
Yeah.
It was up there in cost.
Yeah, it's very
So
large.
when you bring them down, S&P looks at that, they always look at their outstanding liabilities. So the smaller liabilities we have in lawsuits that are outstanding out there, the better it is for our credit rating. Because that, again, they don't see the liquidity, it maintains the liquidity. There's no future on the horizon risk of a lawsuit draining that liquidity, because there's no big lawsuits out there.
Okay, thank you.
Make sense?
Thanks again, gentlemen, appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Have a nice night.
Have a good evening.
You too.